the ebook edition. Welcome to the History in the Shadow. Please subscribe our channel if you want. Let's start. The main story equals the ebook edition. Copyright 2009 by Rachel Starr Thomson. Unseen. Like what you've read. Burning Light and the Advent finish the Seventh World Trilogy. Look them up online and continue the adventure. Table of contents. Prologue. A shadowed past. Run, boy. Run when they see beyond the sky brightly colored paths. A decision is made. The blackness has wings. A world in turmoil. Revelation. Salvation. An unfamiliar soul. Dreams and war. Betrayal. The end begins. The peace of death. We break worlds. Unseen. Prologue. The house was full of the little noises of life. A bright fire crackled in the hearth, and over it the contents of a small iron pot hissed and bubbled. Mary's rocking chair creaked as her deft fingers wove a world in cross-stitch, visions of sunset and starlight. A mourning dove, tucked away in a nest in the corner of the stone window ledge, cooed softly. Mary did not look up when a shadow fell across the picture in her hand. Through her eyelashes she saw a tall, dark-cloaked form with a gleaming knife in its hand. For a tenth of a second Mary's fingers faltered. She regained herself and continued to sew. She bent her head closer to the cross-stitch and her chestnut hair fell over her shoulder. "So you've come," she said, her voice perfectly level. The cloaked figure's voice dripped with venom. "You expected me?" The creak of the rocking chair filled the momentary silence, and the fire crackled. The pot was near to boiling over. "I knew you would keep your promise," Mary said, "though you have been much longer than I expected. And even now you are waiting." The tall figure sneered. "Where is your fool of a husband?" Mary said faintly, "He is coming." Outside, the cooing of the dove had ceased. A man was Rachel Starr Thomson whistling as he came up the path to the cottage. His tune died out, choked by sudden fear, and his footsteps hastened to an urgent pace. The cloaked figure raised the knife in the air. Mary lifted her head suddenly, and her blue eyes pierced through the black cloak to the woman beneath it, momentarily halting the hate-filled advance. "Take care, woman," Mary said, "lest the power you seek to control someday overpower you." The door of the house opened with the striking of wood against stone as John Davies rushed into the danger he sensed all around him. The pot boiled over. The cloaked woman hurried down the hill. She turned to look at the cottage once more, watching as the flames reduced even the stones to ash. She laughed wildly, her laughter swirling into the smoke-filled wind. The green hills around seemed to mourn as the heat and smoke blurred their ancient sides into wavering, uncertain mirages. High in the hills, a hawk cried. The woman turned and strode along the path that led to the town. In the distance she heard a sheepdog barking, and her eyes narrowed as she pictured the small figure who was even now making her way to the ruined house. It would be so easy to kill her, too. The woman's fingers clenched the handle of the knife, slippery with blood, that was now hidden beneath the black folds of her cloak. The world's unseen master would be angry. The girl was nothing, and he did not want needless killing. It was not wise. It was better to let the ignorant live in fear. So he said, Master Scraytalk was a fool. True, at times she sounded just like him, speaking of wisdom for the sake of the future. Only now, with the stench of the kill hidden under her cloak and the wind carrying ashes up to the heavens, with the power of the covenant flame running wild in her veins, she did not care about wisdom. She could hear the girl's footsteps on the hard earth, as the dog barked around her heels. Her fingers gripped the knife tighter, and relaxed. The rush of the covenant flame was beginning to die. She felt it slip away. She wished to kill if only to bring it back, but wisdom came with the going of it. She would obey. The girl would live. Rachel Starr Thomson, a shadowed past. The war is over, and the king has gone from our land. Gone with him are the faithful children of men, and now only I am left. I alone remain to sing the song of the burning light over this blood-stained ground. The earth brethren are gone. I know not where. It seems they are vanquished who once made all men tremble with fear before the strength of wolf and wind and water, of growing thing and of fire. They are gone, and never more shall I hear their battle cries all around me. My heart quakes to think of them conquered, yet how could it be otherwise? Their power was shattered in grief when the king's heart was pierced by the treachery of his beloved ones. Surely the anguish of his heartbreaking must shake this world, so that nothing can stand untouched. And the Shearim, the merry ones, the fairest of creation, they too are gone. They whom no one could kill have destroyed themselves that the children of men might be protected from their own wickedness. With the life force which once danced in their eyes, the Shearim have woven a veil, a barrier between the blackness and men. Yet my heart tells me that even the veil cannot last forever. One day it will worlds unseen grow weak and tear, and the Shearim will pass out of the world forever. How the stars weep for us! But now my blood grows hot within me and visions pass before my eyes. And I, the poet, I, the prophet, will speak. The blackness will not reign victorious always. In the end, the hearts of men will yearn again for their king, and he shall come. Hear all you heavens. Listen to me, all you earth. Rejoice, for he will come again. Yet quietly will it begin. His reign shall not be taken up first on the throne of men, but in their hearts, in the hearts of small things, of insignificant things, of forgotten things. In their hearts shall be kindled the love of the ages, and they shall sing the song of the burning light, and he shall come. The air was just beginning to take on a metallic chill when Maggie passed the orphan house. Its tall wrought iron gates frowned down on her and striped her face with shadows where they blocked the orange light of the windows. Creepers, brown with the coming of winter, wound their way up the red, soot-covered brick walls. The windows were barred and tightly shut. One, on the ground floor, had been cranked open, though bars crossed it. Maggie could hear the clanging and shouts coming from that window, and though she was too far away to feel it, she could imagine the oppressive heat drifting out into the evening. It was the kitchen, a room made hellish by the constant activity of 20 ovens. In the winter, the window would be kept shut to keep Rachel Starr Thomson the icy wind from blowing in and the expensive heat from drifting out. But not yet. Maggie picked up her pace instinctively, as she always did before the glaring visage of the house. Had she been caught outside those walls as a child, she would have been locked in the cupboard, or worse. Now, there was no one to shout her name, no one to threaten her and slap her and tell her not to try running away again. It had been years since the orphan house had held her prisoner, yet the tyranny of the place still held some sway over her soul. So she walked faster. From the kitchen came the harsh shrieking of a matron in a foul mood, and in the yard a dog sent up a dismal howl. The cold seemed to cling to Maggie, seeping through her heavy brown overcoat. She pulled it closer to her and shivered. It was a cold evening in an autumn that had thus far been unusually warm. A dragon-headed iron train screamed over a bridge in the distance. An elderly man with a decorated sword hanging from his belt nodded to her as he sauntered past. The orphan house behind her. Maggie turned down a residential street lined with old houses that were crammed in next to each other like books on a shelf. The street dead-ended in an iron fence that closed in a large property. A stately old house with yellow paint that was peeling and a flower garden that bloomed like the sun in summer. In the quickly fading light, the old house looked somewhat mournful. Most of its flowers had already succumbed to the frost. In an upstairs window a candle was burning, and a stout shape moved around the room in what looked like a waltz. Maggie smiled. She turned from the view of the yellow house and ascended the creaking steps of her own home, the last on the world's unseen bookshelf street. A slim, two-story brick house with peeling blue shutters at the windows. Maggie sighed when she thought of the hours she and Patricia had put into painting them just last summer, while Mrs. Cook, the owner of the house, puttered around in the kitchen baking cookies to feed her girls when they finished. Maggie twisted the brass doorknob and pushed the door open. It protested loudly, and Maggie made a mental note to oil the hinges soon. If Pat had been home, surely the door would have been attended to earlier. She always noticed such things. A bright fire was burning cheerfully in the fireplace, casting its glow over the small room. A painting of a river in the country hung over the mantel, which was covered in little glass figurines, newly dusted and glowing proudly in the firelight. On the wall, tucked in the shadows of the fireplace bricks, a slim sword hung on a hook. Pat had insisted on leaving it with them. How she expected either Maggie or Mrs. Cook to use it was a mystery. Maggie collapsed into a high-backed stuffed chair near the fire without taking off her coat or boots. She closed her eyes and let all of her muscles relax, while the heat folded around her like a cocoon. A loud, cheery voice interrupted her near slumber. "Well, then?" Eva Cook exclaimed, her ample form filling the doorway to the kitchen and blocking most of the light from that part of the house. "You're home. Did you get the parcel?" Maggie sighed with the effort of pulling her body back into action. She reached a red-gloved hand inside her coat and pulled out a small packet wrapped in brown paper. She started to get up, but Mrs. Cook stopped her. "Rachel Starr Thomson, no, dear," she said. "Don't you move. I know a tired body when I see one. Was it a really long walk?" Maggie nodded. "Not too long, really, but I am tired. I always want to go to sleep after being out in the cold." "Winter's coming after all," Mrs. Cook commented. "Though I had hoped we would cheat it this year." She disappeared into the kitchen for a moment, and the light from the homey room came streaming back. She reappeared bearing a saucer and teacup, steaming with hot tea. "Here, dear," Mrs. Cook said. "Drink this." Maggie took the cup and saucer and let the steam from the bittersweet drink warm her face. She took a sip and leaned back again with a smile. "Thank you," she said, "but you don't need to fuss over me. You'd think I'd been gone as long as Pat." Mrs. Cook didn't seem to notice Maggie's teasing tone. "I'm just taking care of you, Maggie Sheffield. You know as well as I do that you're not the strongest bird in the sky. One of these days you'll catch pneumonia, and I'll fuss then. How's your cold?" Maggie chuckled. "Much better, with your tea steaming all the congestion out of me. It's been years since I was really sick. You needn't worry." "I'm not worried," Mrs. Cook said with a sniff. She caught sight of Maggie grinning at her and said, "Not about the likes of you." Maggie dipped her little finger in her tea, stirring it idly. "Something's missing from the tea," she said. "Linley leaf," Mrs. Cook said. "I ran out and was too busy to cut more." Worlds unseen Maggie set her tea aside and pushed herself out of her chair before Mrs. Cook could protest. "I'll get it," she said. She walked lightly to her guardian's side and stood on her tiptoes to kiss the tall old woman's cheek on her way out. Cook watched her march out the front door with a smile. She was so different from the old days, this girl. Eva could remember the days when even a hint of sharpness in her voice would send the little orphan into a fit of shivering, anxious fear. Maggie had been so small and skinny then, her auburn hair tangled and dirty. "You don't want that one," the man from the orphan house had said. "She's no good for nothing, too weak, and ugly besides." Mrs. Cook had seen through the dirt and grime to a child who desperately needed freedom. Margaret Sheffield was precisely the child she wanted. She remembered clearly the first few days, when Maggie learned what it was like to be clean and well-fed and loved. She had accepted everything warily, as though she expected to wake up any moment and find the dream turned into a nightmare. Her greatest fear in those days had been that Patricia Black, herself an orphan, might prove to be an enemy. Pat, in true form, had taken the scared little thing under her wing. Pat had cried the day that Maggie was sent off to Cryneth to live with John and Mary Davies, old friends of the Cooks. Eva had cried too, but she knew it was best. The mountains and Mary's songs were what Maggie needed to heal. Even now, Mrs. Cook had to fight back tears at the thought of the way those years in Cryneth had ended. Rachel Starr Thomson remembered how Maggie had appeared on her back doorstep, half dead and nearly unrecognizable. She remembered how Pat had run for the doctor at the orphan house. She remembered the doctor's words. "She were never a well one. I don't see how she's made it this far with all that smoke in her lungs. If I was you, Mrs. Cook, I'd be looking for a nice burial plot." But Maggie had recovered. Her hands and arms were forever scarred from the burns. She never told anyone exactly what had happened, although they found out later that John and Mary had been killed in a fire. Maggie had been seen digging through the still smoldering ashes for some remnant of the happiest days of her life. The villagers had tried to help her, but she had run away. Somehow Maggie had found happiness again. Somehow she had put it behind her. And every time Mrs. Cook saw the young woman smile, she thanked the stars for the power that had brought Maggie all the way back to her doorstep in London, and home. The Linley tree grew between the house and the iron fence. It hugged the wall like a vine, its silvery bark and the last of its light green leaves beautiful against the soot-smudged brick. Maggie smiled as she reached up into the thin branches, pulling them down so that twigs and leaves brushed her face and baptized her with the scent of life. The leaves rustled as she searched for a good bunch to clip. The warm autumn had been good to the hardy little tree. It was still green in the face worlds unseen of coming winter. Maggie started to hum to herself when a sound made its way to her ears. She frowned, releasing the branches so that they jerked away and quivered above her. There it was again. Something was moving in the dark shadows behind the house. Maggie peered down the alley, but she could see nothing. Cat, she thought. It must be a cat. She shook off the uneasy feeling that had settled on her and finished clipping a branch. As she took a step toward home, something in the alley clattered. She turned, her heart leaping in her throat. What was back there? She turned to leave when the sound of a deep, racking cough sent shivers up her spine. That was no cat. Maggie turned back around and walked quickly, deliberately, toward the safety of the front door. Pat, she thought, would have been in the alley by now, forcing a full confession from whoever was skulking in the shadows. Pity the fellow caught by her fierce questions. But Maggie was not Pat, and Pat was far away in Cryneth. She kept walking. Maggie Sheffield? It was a trembling voice, old, and strangely familiar. It was deep with illness. Maggie turned slowly to see a small, hunched old man step out from the shadows. He stood silhouetted against the fence, and Maggie could not see his face or his features. He stretched out a hand toward her. It was shaking. "Maggie?" he asked again. He took a step forward and Maggie realized that he was about to fall. She dropped the leafy twigs in her hand and rushed forward, grabbing the old man's arm to steady him. He looked up at her with weary, gray eyes. "Thank ye, Maggie," he said. Rachel Starr Thomson. She knew who he was. The relief of recognition flooded her. Those gray eyes had regarded her kindly when she was a child in the Orphan House, and once they had watched her from the safety of the little house in Cryneth. In the Orphan House he had brought presents for the children once or twice a year, mittens and scarves, pieces of candy, sometimes even dolls for the girls and trains for the boys. She hadn't known why he had come to the Davies in Cryneth. Evidently they were old friends. She had never known his full name. The children called him Old Dan. She certainly had no idea what he was doing here now, hiding in an alley behind her home. He began to cough again, and nearly doubled over with the effort. Maggie clutched at him, wishing she could somehow transfer strength from her body into his. He sounded as if he might never stop coughing. But the fit did come to an end, and he leaned against her, exhausted. She was alarmed at how thin and light he was. "Come," she said, guiding him. "I live here, just a few more steps. We'll take good care of you." Maggie helped him up the steps and opened the door. The hinges squeaked out an announcement of her return. Cook appeared from the kitchen already talking. "I was beginning to wonder if you'd run away out there." "Heavens, Maggie, what took you so?" She stopped in mid-sentence. "Heavens," she breathed. Maggie helped the weak old man into the high-back chair near the fire. He nearly fell into it. Maggie removed his threadbare gloves and began rubbing his fingers between her own hands. She wanted to say something, but his eyes were worlds unseen closed, and so she kept her mouth shut. When his hands felt a bit warmer, she took the muddy boots from his feet and set them near the fire to dry, while she wrapped him in a blanket snatched from the arms of Mrs. Cook's rocking chair. The lady of the house emerged from the depths of the kitchen with a washtub full of hot water. "Come on, Maggie," she said. "In with his feet." Mrs. Cook pressed a hand against the old man's wrinkled forehead. "Fever," she muttered. "Maggie, get another blanket from the cupboard upstairs. Thick one. Make that too. He's shivering." Maggie rushed up the stairs, taking them two at a time, and threw open the cupboard at the end of the narrow hallway. She grabbed 2 thick blankets and flew back downstairs with them. Cook was stoking the fire, while the kettle shrieked its readiness in the kitchen. "Get the tea, would you, dear?" Mrs. Cook asked in a tone of voice that made it clear she was not asking. Maggie went into the whitewashed kitchen where the copper kettle rattled on the surface of the wood stove. She snatched it off and poured the water into a white teapot. She re-entered the living room with Mrs. Cook's largest teacup and saucer, as well as 2 more just in case, and ducked back into the kitchen to fetch the teapot. When she came back out, Old Dan's eyes were open and Mrs. Cook seemed strangely agitated. Maggie shifted her feet and licked her lips uncomfortably, feeling that she had missed something important. "This is Old Dan." She felt like a child saying the name, Rachel Starr Thomson, which was not really much of a name at all. "He's a friend. We know each other," Mrs. Cook said stiffly. Maggie's eyebrows raised a good half-inch. "You do?" she asked incredulously. "Evie and I are old friends," Old Dan said weakly, with a tinge of humor in his voice. Cook stood abruptly and started up the stairs. She turned when she was halfway up. "I don't want him going up and down stairs in his condition," she said. "We'll fix up the guest room." Maggie nodded. Silently, she picked up the bucket of coal that lay beside the fire and took a box of matches from the mantel. She felt Old Dan's eyes watching her, but she couldn't bring herself to say anything. Cook had seemed almost angry. She took the coal and matches to a small, cold room just off of the living room. It had a fireplace of its own, and she knelt down to prepare the room for its new occupant. Soon she had a fire blazing, and the lonely little room seemed cheered. Starched white curtains hung by its windows, overlooking a single bed. Cook entered the room and started to make the bed with flannel sheets and a large feather blanket and pillows. A tiny bedside table held a gas lamp and an old book with gold writing on its cover. It had been years, Maggie thought, since the room had been occupied. She didn't recognize the book. Perhaps a friend of Pat's had left it. Before long, the room had been transformed. The lonely chill gave way before the warmth of the fire and the glow of the oil lamp that spilled onto the deep green blankets. Cook stood with her hands on her hips and looked the room worlds unseen over with a satisfied nod. Maggie slipped out the door to get Old Dan. He was sitting totally still except for the slight shaking of his hands. His eyes were open and he was staring into the fire, seemingly lost in thought. He didn't hear Maggie's approach. She reached out a hand and laid it on his arm. He jumped slightly, then reached up his own gnarled hand and covered hers. "I'm sorry," Maggie said. "I didn't mean to startle you." He patted her hand. "No harm done, dear. Your room's ready," she explained, and took his arm to help him up. He stood with a struggle, and leaned on her as they walked to the room. "It's not much," Maggie said. Old Dan chuckled, and the effort made him fight to catch his breath again before speaking. "Don't forget I'm an old alley dweller," he said with a twinkle in his eye. "The Emperor's palace couldn't be any nicer." He started to laugh again and set off a fit of coughing. Maggie lowered him onto the bed. She cast a concerned look at Mrs. Cook, who had a man's nightshirt draped over her arm. "He'll be all right," Mrs. Cook said. "Go off to bed, Maggie. I'll watch after our guest." "Get." Maggie left the room reluctantly. As she climbed the stairs to her own room, a flood of weariness washed over her. She had forgotten how tired she was. The voices drifted up the stairs, rising and falling through Rachel Starr Thomson the cracks in the floor into Maggie's room. She turned over in her sleep, pulling her quilt closer to her ears. The voices sharpened, and Maggie awoke. For a moment she thought she had been dreaming, but then she heard them again. The conversation downstairs had grown heated. She knew it was none of her business, but curiosity got the better of her groggy mind. She swung her feet out of bed, feeling the shock of cold when they touched the hardwood floor. The floorboards creaked as she lit the lamp beside her bed and pulled a robe on over her nightgown. Picking up the lamp, she stepped out into the hall. The voices had quieted. Maggie stepped lightly down the stairs and through the living room to the spare room. The light was on, leaking through the slight crack where the door was not quite shut. Maggie peered in through the crack. Cook had moved her rocking chair to the bedside. Maggie could see her each time she rocked forward. Her eyes were swollen. "You shouldn't have come here, Daniel," Mrs. Cook said, a hardness in her voice that Maggie had never heard before. "I'm sorry, Evie," Old Dan's voice answered. "Perhaps you're right." He coughed painfully. "Truth is, I was afraid out there. I've never been so cold." I've never been afraid to die before, but now, well, I didn't think ye would turn me away." Mrs. Cook's voice sounded as though she might lose control and start crying again. "No, Daniel, don't talk nonsense. Of course it was better that you come here than stay out there with such a sickness." Her voice lowered, but Maggie still caught the words. "If only Maggie didn't know you." "I didn't know she was here," old Dan said. Worlds unseen, the rocking chair leaned forward with a forceful creak. "Promise me you won't talk to her about anything more than the weather, Daniel Seaton. No talk of the old days. I don't want Maggie tangled up with the council." "There is no council," Daniel's voice said. "Or have you forgotten? There's naught left now but you and me and the others, all scattered and hiding, and dead, some of us. The council is finished. And may it stay that way." There was silence for a moment, and then Daniel spoke again. "Have you forgotten, Evie? Have you forgotten the way it was in the old days? Surely you canna hate its memory so much." "It was all a game back then," Mrs. Cook said. "We were children playing with fire." There was a heavy sigh from the bed. "'Twas a glorious fire," old Dan said. "But dangerous, yes. I want Maggie kept far away from it," Mrs. Cook said. "It was bad enough that she was there when Mary—" "I know," old Dan said. "Evie, there's something I need to be tellin' ye." There was an expectant silence, and old Dan spoke again. His voice was barely a whisper this time, and Maggie was not sure if she had heard him right. "I saw her," he said. The rocking chair leaned forward, and Maggie could see Mrs. Cook's face. It had drained of color. Maggie felt suddenly cold. The cold came from within, as though childhood fears had passed over her. She had half a mind to turn and go back to bed, but she knew the fear would only follow her. She stayed Rachel Starr Thomson where she was. "Evelyn?" Mrs. Cook asked, her voice suddenly as weak as Daniel's. Old Dan said. "Did she know you?" Mrs. Cook asked. "I didna think so," old Dan said. "But then this sickness. It makes me very afraid, Evie." Mrs. Cook let out a noise like an angry sob. "How long will she hound us? Was she not content to destroy us with her lies?" "It wasn't as though she came after me," the old man said. "We stumbled across each other, quite by accident." "And John and Mary?" Mrs. Cook said. "Was that an accident? How many more of us will die before she's content to leave us alone?" Maggie closed her eyes as the shock of what she was hearing sunk in. For a moment she forgot herself and leaned against the door. It swung open and Maggie stumbled into the room. Cook jumped half out of her chair, and then sank back into it with a moan. Maggie heard a sigh from the bed. No one spoke. "I heard you talking," Maggie said. "I don't understand." "Go back to bed," Mrs. Cook said gently. Maggie shook her head. "No. John and Mary, you said a woman killed them." Maggie took a step nearer the rocking chair, almost menacing in her approach. She was trembling. "John and Mary's death was an accident, wasn't it?" Mrs. Cook seemed supremely unhappy. She began to answer, bit her lip, and finally nodded. "Yes, Maggie. It was an world's unseen accident." "You don't believe that." "I don't know anything to the contrary." "But you don't believe it. You think this woman killed them. You think they were—" she faltered. "Murdered." Mrs. Cook reached a weary hand to a strand of gray hair that had worked itself loose from her bun. She brushed it back and regarded the young woman standing before her, eyes pleading. "Sit down, Maggie." Mrs. Maggie obeyed, sinking into the deep green feather blanket on old Dan's bed. "No," Mrs. Cook said wearily. "I don't believe the fire was an accident." Maggie leaned forward. "Then what?" Mrs. Cook leaned back in the rocking chair and listened to the pop of the firewood in the hearth. "When we were very young," she said slowly, "we were part of a council, John Davies and Mary and Daniel and I. We were studying old legends and phenomena, things that couldn't be explained naturally." Daniel spoke up, and his voice seemed stronger than before. "It was glorious," he said. Cook ignored him. "It was dangerous," she said. "There are powers in this world, Maggie, or outside of it, as it may be, that are best left alone." "Who was the woman?" Maggie couldn't remember the name they had mentioned. Evelyn, Mrs. Cook asked. Her voice suddenly grew more tired. She was nearly one of us. She would have become one of the council if we had voted her in. Mary stopped that Rachel Starr Thomson from happening. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Thank heavens. She were an evil one, old Dan suddenly added. Swore she'd kill Mary for opposing her. Mrs. Cook shot Daniel a scathing look. Maggie felt that Mrs. Cook had planned to leave that part out. We didn't think she meant it, Mrs. Cook said. We didn't think there was any real danger. Not until the fire. Do you have any proof? Maggie asked. Cook shook her head. Only the warning bells that went off in my own heart, and the memory of her black face all twisted and laughing. Laughing, Maggie whispered. Cook looked at the young woman and suddenly burst into tears. Oh, Maggie, she cried, reaching for the girl who once more looked so orphaned. She rose from her rocking chair and enfolded Maggie in her embrace. For a long time they remained together, Mrs. Cook holding on to Maggie as though her tight embrace could stop the sorrow from coming. When at long last Maggie lifted a hollow-eyed face, old Dan was watching them with a rolled-up piece of parchment in his hands. What is that? Mrs. Cook asked. She did not sound as though she wanted an answer. It was Evelyn's, old Dan said quite simply. I took it from her. Mrs. Cook paled. When? Not 2 weeks ago, he said. When I saw her. She was in Gals, in an inn. I snuck into her room and this was there, and I thought it was important. So I took it. Worlds unseen, why? Mrs. Cook asked. It's important, old Dan repeated. It means something. I've been up to see the laird with it. A flush of anger rose in Eva Cook's cheeks. You mean you'd still speak to that? Old Dan shrugged. I don't suppose he's any friend of hers, not after all this time. It was his counsel she ripped to pieces. Why did you come back here? Mrs. Cook asked. The laird wouldn't see me, he said. So I was taking the scroll to Pravik. Maybe Jaron Huss can read it. He held up the parchment, and his hand began to shake violently. In a moment his body was racked with the terrible cough, and Maggie saw blood on his hand where he covered his mouth. Trouble is, he rasped when he had regained control of his body. I'm not sure I'll make it to Pravik. Mrs. Cook walked slowly to old Dan's side. She laid her hand on his forehead. You're burning up, she said. Daniel, what happened to you in Gals? She looked at me, old Dan said. I didn't think she recognized me, at least not at the time. But her eyes met mine. His bony frame sunk back farther into the bed. All that night I dreamed about her eyes. The coughing fits woke me up. It's been getting worse ever since. As though to illustrate his words, old Dan began to cough again. This time, blood ran from his mouth down his chin and onto the sheets and blankets. Cook ran from the room for water and rags to clean the blood. Maggie could only stare at the helpless old man, while her own blood ran cold. She knew Rachel Starr Thomson what they were thinking. Somehow, she knew it was true. This was no natural illness, but a living evil that was slowly murdering a frail old man. When the coughing fit had at last ended, old Dan gasped for air. Every breath racked his body with pain, and he shivered uncontrollably. Cook sat at his side, holding one gnarled hand in her own, whispering words of comfort. The fire was dying out. Maggie went in search of more coal. In truth, she could think of nothing but escaping from that room. From the deep recesses of her memory, laughter followed her out. An hour had passed before Maggie entered again. The room resounded with silence. The fire had nearly gone out. Cook was still clutching old Dan's hand, stroking it. He opened his eyes and Maggie wanted to cry when she saw how much worse he looked. His skin was horribly pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He struggled to sit up when he saw her. She hurried to sit down on the bed so that he would not waste his energy. He slumped back onto the pillows and his fingers reached for the parchment that was laying next to him. Evie, he said in a voice that was barely a whisper. How will it get to Pravik? To Huss? It's important. The energy to speak seemed to drain out of him onto the pillows. Maggie picked up the parchment in one hand and took the fingers of the old man who had once brought her toys at the orphan house. "I'll take it," Maggie said. Cook's eyes snapped up to look at Maggie's face, her own full of horror. World's unseen Maggie only leaned closer to old Dan, who had closed his eyes again. "Do you hear me?" she whispered. "I'll take it to Pravik." He nodded, ever so slightly, and a smile tried to struggle free from his face. He did not move again that night. As Maggie left the room to trudge back to her bed, she turned to see tears running down Mrs. Cook's face. Daniel Seaton died the next morning. If he had other friends in London, Mrs. Cook did not know of them. Maggie was sent after the undertaker, and the austere little man arrived before noon. A coffin was available that would do the chore, and the body of old Dan was taken to an old graveyard and buried before the sun had set on the day of his death. Maggie and Mrs. Cook watched as the black box was lowered into the ground by men who did not care, while dry autumn leaves blew through the maze of tombstones. A bell was rung in the little stone building that watched over the graveyard, and Maggie held tightly to Mrs. Cook's arm as they leaned on each other. "Farewell, Daniel Seaton," Eva Cook whispered as the bell pealed its melancholy song. It was over quickly. The two women climbed into a waiting carriage and began the slow ride back home. The red brick of the orphan house glared down at them as the horses clopped past, and Maggie turned her face from it. Tucked inside her coat, the parchment scroll burned an awareness of Rachel Starr Thomson itself into her. She had decided to leave for Pravik the next day. World's unseen run, boy, run, last call to board the Crosswind. The deep-voiced call rose up over the noise of the crowds and brought tears to Mrs. Cook's eyes. "Are you sure you won't reconsider, Maggie?" she asked. "I need to do this," Maggie said. She smiled as she looked into Mrs. Cook's eyes. "It will be all right," she said. "You'll see. I'll come back soon, and I'll write you the minute I get to Pravik." "Why did you ever make a promise to that Dan Seaton?" Mrs. Cook asked, shaking her head. "It's not just the promise," Maggie said. "There are questions in my head that need answering, and somehow I think I'll find the answers in Pravik. I'll be all right, Mrs. Cook, truly. There. Now I've made you a promise." She set her ragged little trunk down on the dock and reached for the old woman who had given her so much. They clung tightly to each other, and Maggie felt Mrs. Cook's body stiffen in a gallant effort to keep from sobbing. Maggie pulled away from the embrace and looked up at the sails of the Crosswind that would soon catch the sea breeze and head away Rachel Starr Thomson from the island she had always called home. Away to the continent, land of history, home of the empire, great dark place of adventure. She picked up her trunk and squared her shoulders, willing herself to look her dearest friend in the face one more time. More than anything she feared the sight of Mrs. Cook's tears. They were the only thing with the power to drain her of all resolve and return her to London. Even now. Their eyes met, and Maggie's vision of Mrs. Cook's stout form standing tall and brave misted over, as tears sprang to her own eyes. "Goodbye," Maggie croaked. She forced herself to turn away and walk to the ship that creaked impatiently as it bobbed on the water of the harbor. The sailors had begun to haul the gangplank up into the ship as Maggie ran up, calling out for them to wait. They frowned at her, and one of the men spit over the side and muttered something under his breath. Maggie called up her thanks as they lowered the plank once more. When she and her battered trunk were safely aboard the ship, Maggie found a spot at the rail and looked into the crowd for one more glimpse of Mrs. All she could see was a mass of coats and hats and moving bodies, and though she tried to make sense of the bewildering view, she could not find her old friend. Perhaps it was best. It was a clear, sunny day, and the sails filled with wind as the boat moved swiftly over the water of the salt channel, away from the island of Brillen. The cries of the gulls in the harbor changed to the sounds of water and wind, the feel of salt spray and the warmth of the sun. The chill of the last few days had given way to warmth, belying the coming winter, worlds unseen, although the spray made Maggie glad of her old brown coat. After a while Maggie grew tired of standing. She propped her trunk up under the rail and leaned against it, sliding down to the deck. Drowsiness, the effect of far too many conflicting emotions, settled over her. She pulled her cap down to shade her eyes and fell asleep. Maggie woke up to the bustle and noise of the crew as the crosswind moved into port in the Galsic town of Calais. The sun had gone into the regression of early evening, and the air had grown colder. Maggie got to her feet unsteadily and reached for her trunk. Calais was bewildering. The port was full of fishing boats, and the smell of salt and fish mingled in the air, making Maggie's stomach queasy. Fishermen, housemaids, vendors hawking their wares, and children playing tag formed a crushing mass of people. Maggie held tightly to her trunk as she descended the plank. Suddenly very aware that she wasn't sure what to do next, Maggie allowed herself to be carried by the flow of the crowd. She soon found herself on the outskirts of the harbor, looking into the town. Darkness was settling fast, and street lanterns came on like fireflies as the lamplighters went about their business. Laughter spilled out from a nearby pub where men from the docks were gathered after a hard day's work. Maggie stopped a big man on his way to the rough-looking place. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, trying not to notice Rachel Starr Thomson what a grim face he had. "But I need to find an inn and I'm not sure." She looked up at him for a moment, and the gentleness in his eyes caught her by surprise. "There's a good one not far from here," the man said. He pointed her down the street and gave her directions which twisted through the town in labyrinthine fashion. Maggie tried hard not to let the string of lefts, rights, and on the corner of blur together. The man tipped his hat. "Good evening to you," he said, and Maggie set off in the direction he had indicated. It didn't take long for Maggie to realize that something was wrong, either with the directions or with her recollection of them. She kept going uneasily. As the town grew darker and less friendly, she stopped abruptly and whirled around at the sound of footsteps behind her. She could see nothing in the shadows, but her fingers tightened their grip on her trunk all the same. She knew better than to trust the darkness. When the street remained still and no more menacing noises found their way to her ears, Maggie turned slowly and began to search out her way once more. A moment later they were there again. Footsteps. She picked up her pace. She had not walked more than a block when she came to a dead end, a high brick wall crumbling with age. She reached out her hand to touch it, willing it to disappear and become the well-lit window of an inn. Behind her, she heard the sound of a match flaring to life. "Out a little late, ain't you?" a voice asked. Maggie turned to see two men. The burning light of a small oil lamp world's unseen illuminating unshaven faces. One of them played with a knife, twirling it in his fingers. The other man grinned at his fellow, then looked at Maggie again. "Didn't nobody tell you this ain't a good neighborhood?" he asked. "It's crawling with rabble." The man with the knife laughed. "So what you got in there?" the speaker asked. He gestured toward the trunk. "Nothing," Maggie said, finding her voice. "Only some clothes." She thought of what would happen if they got to the money hidden in the bottom of the trunk. She would be stranded here in Gals without a way to get back home, much less reach Pravik. "Oh, come now," the speaker said again. He moved forward menacingly. "It don't take much to make us happy." Maggie started to move in front of the trunk, when she gasped in fear. A huge black shadow was moving up behind the men. Glowing eyes announced that the shadow was alive. A lilting voice, from somewhere behind the shadow, drew the men's attention to the threat behind them. "Picking fights with women, boys? What would your mothers say?" The men whirled around, falling back before the black shadow. The first man dropped the lamp as his partner looked for an opening to run. The glass of the lamp cracked in pieces, but a faint light kept burning. "Don't tell me you give up already?" the voice said. The wiry figure of a young man stepped out from behind the big shadow. "We haven't even come to blows yet. Rachel Starr Thomson, we didn't mean nothing," the man with the knife said. "We was just having some fun." "So am I," the young man said. "Isn't this fun?" The shadow growled and opened a mouth full of gleaming teeth. The man with the knife dropped to his knees on the pavement. "Let us go," he begged. The young man sighed, then stepped aside and slapped the shadow on the rump. "All right, bear," he said. "Move aside." The shadow moved obligingly, opening the way down the street. The men scrambled to their feet and raced for the safety of the alleys. Maggie had sunk down to the ground, her back against the crumbling brick wall. The young man watched the ruffians go with his arms crossed over his chest, then turned back to Maggie with a grin. The grin faded fast at the look on her face. He stepped closer to her and offered his hand, pulling her to her feet. For the first time Maggie got a good look at her rescuer. He was young, as his voice indicated, probably no more than 18 or 19. He was lanky and none too tall. He wore a brown vest over a billowy white shirt, and his trousers were checkered brown, green, and white. His curly black hair seemed a little overdue for a cut, and a bright gold earring glimmered in one ear. His feet were bare. Maggie stammered, unsure of what to say. Thank you. The young man smiled, a wide grin that showed off straight white teeth and made his eyes dance. My pleasure, he said, and dropped into a sweeping bow. Nicolas Fisher, at Worlds Unseen, your service. He stepped back and placed a hand on the furry black shadow beside him. And this is Bear. Nice to meet you. Both of you. Maggie couldn't help but laugh. Bear? Doesn't he have a name? Nicolas shrugged. I suppose he does. But he's never told it to me, so I won't insult him by making one up. I call him Bear, and he calls me Boy, and that works quite well since that's what we are. Do you do this often? Maggie asked. Rescue people, I mean, is that what we did? Nicolas asked. He seemed amused. Can't say we've done much of it before, but after this we might have to make a habit of it. More fun than I've had in a while. But I suppose you're not wandering around at night for the lark of it. What did you come here for? I was looking for an inn, Maggie said weakly. I'm afraid I got lost. I'm afraid you did, Nicolas said with a frown. There's an inn not far from here I can take you to. It's not exactly a high-class establishment, but it's a place to sleep and eat if you're hungry. That sounds good, Maggie said. She reached for her trunk, but Nicolas beat her to it. He picked it up and offered Maggie his arm, and she took it with a tentative smile. For all she knew, the strange young man could be after the same thing as the alley-dwelling ruffians. Still, she couldn't help liking him and trusting him. Nicolas and Bear took Maggie to a dilapidated, two-story establishment with a sign that proclaimed it the house of Rachel Starr Thomson dreams. Light poured into the street from the wide windows. Inside, the dining room was filled with happy chaos. Bear waited outside while Nicolas led Maggie in. The brightness of the room hurt her eyes. The walls were painted with brightly colored murals, showing fantastic, dreamlike scenes. Shouting, singing, laughing people packed the room. Galsic men with small pots of ale and gypsies in brilliantly stitched and colored clothing sat at round tables, eyeing one another suspiciously while they drank and ate a rich-smelling stew. Pipe smoke and noise mingled together and rose to the bright red ceiling. Lost in observation, Maggie hardly noticed that Nicolas was talking to a gaudy woman wearing huge earrings and a green dress. The din of the room was overwhelming, and it took a moment for her to recognize Nicolas's voice shouting over the cacophony. There's a room upstairs for you, Nicolas said. Follow me. Nicolas and the woman weaved through the crowd. Maggie followed after them, feeling out of place with her drab brown coat and cap and battered trunk, shyly moving through a world filled with color and laughter and reeking with the pungent smell of ale and cheap wine. They entered a stairwell on the other side of the room. Inside, the noise instantly died down, as though someone had thrown a blanket over it. The stairs creaked underfoot and their white paint was peeling badly, but Maggie welcomed the quiet. At the top of the stairs, the woman led Maggie and Nicolas down a long thin hall to the third door on the right. Worlds unseen, she pulled out a heavy key ring and unlocked the door, opening a small room with a tiny bed in one corner and a large window without curtains that looked out onto the street. It's a nice little room, the woman said. You will like it. And if there is a problem, you just ask for Madam. Maggie nodded, and Madam turned to leave. She stopped to pat Nicolas on the cheek and exclaim remorsefully, And Nicolas, you will not be staying with us? We have missed you. Nicolas shook his head. You're too kind, he said with a grin. But Bear would never forgive me if I left him on the street all night. I promised him we'd be out of Calais before sunrise. You're not in trouble? Madam asked. Nicolas shook his head. No, of course no, Madam said. Just always the wanderer. Someday you come and settle down here. It would not be so bad. Nicolas only smiled, and Madam heaved a sigh. Ah well, she said, wiping away a supposed tear. Someday you will listen. She turned and swept out of the room, leaving Maggie and Nicolas alone for the moment. You're leaving, then? Maggie asked. He nodded. The forest is calling me. Bear's antsy to get away. You'll be all right? Maggie nodded. Thank you. For everything. Nicolas shrugged, seeming almost embarrassed. Somewhere in the 3 sentences that had passed between them, he had lost his cocksure attitude. Rachel Starr Thomson, glad I could help, he said, and abruptly left the room. Maggie watched him go with a puzzled frown and wondered why she was so reluctant to let him leave. With a sigh she stretched out on the bed, blew out the oil lamp beside it, and stared out at the chimneys of Calais until her eyes closed of their own accord and she fell asleep. Nicolas Fisher could not shut her face out of his mind. He walked along the edge of the gutter and whistled as he tried to conjure up images of the forest he longed for. But each time he tried, another image rose up unbidden. A timid face that didn't know it was soot-streaked, green eyes and auburn hair that was half hidden under an old cap. It was a nameless face, and he could kick himself for forgetting to ask her name. Bear grunted as he rambled alongside his master, and Nicolas reached out to bury his hand in Bear's stiff black fur. We'll be out soon, old friend, Nicolas said. Can you smell the trees? Even as the words left his mouth, the urge to turn back nearly overwhelmed him. It was not unfamiliar, this feeling, this pull that threatened to carry him all the way back to the House of Dreams. He had felt this way when he first saw Bear, cowering in a cage underneath a circus tent. He hadn't been able to leave then either. Not until he had freed the cub and gone dashing off into the night with him. The circus had hunted for them for nearly a week, but had given up at last. A wind kicked up, swirling the leaves in the street, and worlds unseen the skin on the back of Nicolas's neck prickled. The wind carried voices with it, faraway voices. The scroll leaves a heavy scent. The hound will have no trouble. Ugly beast. Be careful. He heard sniffing, the deep, dangerous sniffing of a bloodhound catching a scent. A long howl filled the air with mournful dread. It was going for her, for the girl at the House of Dreams. Nicolas was sure of it, as sure as he was that there was not a minute to spare. He turned and ran for the inn. Maggie awoke to the feeling that something was horribly wrong. She tried to sit up and found that dread was pressing her down like a weight. She could hardly move. She thought she would suffocate, and panic began to well up inside of her. The door to her room banged open and Nicolas rushed in, slamming the door behind him. He turned, grabbed Maggie's trunk, and began frantically shaking her. Get up! He rasped in a hoarse whisper. Get up! You've got to get out of here now. The pressure broke, and Maggie sat up, lightheaded and breathing hard. She slipped down to the floor and began hunting for her shoes. Nicolas joined her on the floor, snatching one of the shoes Rachel Starr Thomson from under the bed. Hurry, he said. What's going on? Maggie asked. There's something after you. He stopped abruptly as a strange sound welled up from somewhere below, out in the street. It started low and rose till it drowned out the pounding of his heart in his ears. Maggie felt as though her heart had stopped. For a moment both she and Nicolas sat in frozen silence on the floor, and then the panic returned. Maggie pulled her shoes on. Nicolas had moved to the window. She moved questioningly to his side. He put a finger to his lips in warning. His eyes were fixed on something in the street. She leaned closer to the window and saw it too. Something huge and black was moving below. It seemed to melt into the night shadows, rendering it nearly invisible. Maggie heard it sniffing, drawing deep breaths and then letting them out again. Tendrils of greenish smoke became visible in the shadows. It leaped suddenly toward the inn, and Nicolas and Maggie heard a crashing noise underneath their feet. It had broken through the door. They looked at each other. For a long moment they stood frozen in each other's eyes. Another howl rose, filling the empty spaces of the inn like water in the swamped hold of a ship. Someone in the inn screamed, even as heavy footfalls tore at the stairs. It was coming. Nicolas dropped Maggie's trunk and threw it open, searching through it until he had found the bag of money at the bottom. He thrust it at her and propped the trunk against worlds unseen the door. He moved to the bed and started to push it, but abandoned the effort as the sound of heavy breathing drew near. He ran for the window and yanked it open. Before Maggie realized what he was doing, he had thrown himself out. She leaned over the sill. Behind her the door shuddered. She threw a desperate glance over her shoulder. Green smoke was curling its way under the door. Her lungs started to constrict again. She turned back to see Nicolas picking himself up off the street, apparently unharmed. "Jump!" he called. "I'll catch you." Maggie held tightly to the windowsill and lowered herself out as a splintering sound announced the creature's presence in the room. Her fingers clutched the windowsill with a will of their own, frozen by fear. "Let go!" Nicolas shouted. His voice sounded far away. Maggie's eyes were drawn to the shadow falling slowly across the window. Green smoke twined around her face, playing with her senses. Dimly she knew she should let go, but her fingers wouldn't loosen their grip. The shadow seemed to be moving so slowly it would never arrive. Her eyelids grew heavy, and she smelled flowers. Then death. Far away, she heard Nicolas screaming at her. What was he saying? The creature was at the window. She saw teeth and claws, and a humped back bristling with black spikes. The beast howled, and in her ears the cry of the hound sounded like 1,000 screams. Her eyes widened in terror as claws swept toward her. Rachel Starr Thomson, she let go. Nicolas staggered back with her weight, but he caught her. He lowered her to the ground and she clung to him for an instant, terrified. He pulled away from her, pulled at her. Through the streets, as the city blurred past them, they ran. Behind them came howling, smoke, glowing eyes, and the smell of death. They ran toward the sea, Nicolas in the lead, pulling at Maggie's hand and yelling at her to run faster. She clung to his hand as if it was life itself. To let go meant death. At least if she held on she would not die alone. Their feet barely touched the cobblestones that glared red with lamplight before them. They seemed to fly like the gulls overhead. The smell of salt filled the damp air as they ran to the nets and docks and black water of the harbor. Nicolas dashed over the docks. He heard the gulls overhead, crying, calling to him. "It is close. Seek safety in the sails." Nicolas ran to the end of a wooden dock and jumped into the icy water, pulling Maggie after him. She clutched the edge of the dock and watched him with eyes wide with terror, waiting for him. Cold water soaked her skirts and pulled at her. "What next? Can you swim?" he asked. She nodded and began to pull her skirts up to free her legs. "Then come," he said. They let go of the dock and struck out for a small ship that floated silently in the ocean a short way out. The water grew colder as it deepened, and Nicolas heard Maggie gasp for air behind him. Worlds unseen he heard howling. And the gulls. He reached the anchor rope and began to pull himself up. He stopped and reached back for Maggie. She took his hand and he pulled her up onto the rope. It was slippery in his hands, but he climbed with all of the strength he could muster. The rope shook with the effort. In minutes the two spilled over the rail onto the deck of the ship. For a moment they simply lay there, letting the wood absorb some of the water from their clothes and hair, panting for breath. Nicolas rolled over on his hands and knees as a low, mournful howl made his hair stand on end. He heard water churning. It was coming. There was a skittering noise, a scratching and chirping and squeaking. Mice and rats exploded out of the doors and hatches on the deck and ran down the sides of the ship to the water. A large mouse stopped and stared at Nicolas, whiskers twitching. "In the hold. Burning in the hold. Burn it, boy. Burn the hound thing. Burn the death thing." Nicolas grabbed Maggie's hand and hauled her to her feet. They stumbled toward the door of the hold. It was dark as pitch below, and Nicolas ran his hands over crates and netting, searching desperately. The ship began to rock as something pulled at the anchor rope. He found a box of matches and muttered a blessing on the mice. He lit one, his hands trembling. It illuminated a hold full of dry wooden crates. The floor was littered with rope and straw. In the matchlight he could see Maggie's face, drawn, and Rachel Starr Thomson lined with fear. Her eyes burned big and green, and her hair hung in wet strands. Her cap had been lost in the ocean, though the coat still clung to her. The boat tipped wildly to starboard as something came up the anchor rope. "Girl," Nicolas whispered hoarsely. "My name is Maggie," she interrupted. "Maggie, go find the lifeboat. Get it into the water and row as fast and as far as you can. If the Hound is too close, just jump. Get in the water, understand?" "What about you?" she asked. "I'll follow you," he said. "Just do as I say. Now." She gave him one last, torn glance and disappeared up the ladder onto the deck. He watched her go, imagery of the Hound on deck filling him with dread. Tendrils of green smoke were working their way through the floor into the hold. Nicolas made a bag with his shirt and stuffed the matchbox into it. Inside an open crate he found 6 or 7 more boxes of matches, all of them full and dry. He added them to the collection and climbed the ladder just as heavy footfalls began to thud across the deck. He emerged from the door to see the Hound staring at him, moving slowly forward. It seemed unsteady on the rolling deck. Nicolas resisted the urge to look back and make sure Maggie was safe. He was sure that if he took his eyes from the beast, it would be on him in a second. It was less a thing of the shadows here and more solid, more real. Green smoke still played around its face, and the stench of death still desecrated the air around it. Its eyes narrowed as Nicolas stood tall before it. A low growl emerged worlds unseen from the thing, and the deck shuddered underfoot. Nicolas backed away slowly. The growl rose into the howl of a beast about to finish its hunt. Nicolas turned and ran for the rigging. The beast's crashing footsteps followed. He threw himself up into the ropes, climbing like a madman. Clawed feet tore at the rigging below him. He swayed wildly in the air, still moving upward. Teeth tore at the rigging on deck, and the ropes Nicolas clung to were severed. He swung through the air, releasing the ropes and flying toward the mast. He caught hold of the mast and clung to it tightly, wrapping his legs around the swaying wood. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a box of matches. He struck one furiously, again and again, willing it to ignite. Frustrated, he threw the match away and reached for another. Below, the Hound threw its weight against the mast. The whole ship rolled in the waves. Another 2 boxes of matches slipped from Nicolas's shirt and spun wildly down toward the beast. He held on desperately with his legs, striking a match again and again. He threw the match back into the box from whence it had come and watched the whole thing blaze to life. The heat in his hand threatened to burn him, and he threw it at the nearby sail. The white cloth burst into flames. Still he struck at the matches. The sickening sound of wood splintering filled his ears. In slow motion the mast began to fall, hindered by the rigging all around it. He threw another blazing missile as the mast gave way. Rachel Starr Thomson, the matchbox, landed on a pile of nets near the Hound, and they too flared up. Nicolas reached for a rope as the mast fell, catching it with not a second to spare. He hung by the rope, looking down at the glowing-eyed Hound and the blazing nets. The fire was spreading along the deck. The flames from the sail ate away at the ropes. A heavy piece of cloth suddenly came down, straight at the Hound. In an instant the ship underneath the creature's black feet was ablaze, its whole world a sudden flaming hell. It screamed. Out on the water, Maggie heard the scream. She clutched the oars of the lifeboat and watched as the blazing ship collapsed on itself. Gulls swirled overhead like vultures around a dying beast. Their calls sounded the word of victory. The ship exploded. She buried her face in her sleeve as the waves rocked and tumbled around her. Burning brands landed everywhere around the little boat. "I'll follow you," he had said. The gulls were calling again. Strange cries. 8 or 9 of the birds glided in the air over Maggie's head, and she lifted a tear-stained face in wonder. What were they? "Maggie." The voice was weak, but definitely there. Maggie jumped to her feet, ignoring the precarious swaying of the boat, and rushed to the side. Nicolas was there, reaching out a shaking hand. His face was streaked with soot and sweat, and a burn glowed on his cheek. Maggie grasped his hand and pulled him toward the boat. Just before he climbed in, he grinned. "Worlds unseen, we did it," he said hoarsely as he slid to the bottom of the boat. Maggie threw her coat around him, and he laid his head back and listened to the gulls. Rachel Starr Thomson, when they see beyond the sky tonight, I gazed into the fire to shut out the darkness around me. The flames danced in shapes and whispered words. I, the poet-prophet, have seen the future. I have seen the signs of his coming again. No one cares. I wander this world and speak of him softly in their ears, but they do not wish to hear. Not to this generation will he return. Already they forget what it was to have him in the world. Already the people of this earth turn to stone, and forget the heart that once beat in their breasts. Cold-hearted creatures of darkness. Without leadership, men squabble and fight. They take refuge in tribes and turn against their neighbors, fighting over bits of land and food like starving animals. And even the animals are not what they once were. The men of this generation care not what the future holds. Yet I have seen it. I write these words in hope that one day the ice hearts of men will begin to melt. Then they will read the words of the prophet, and my words will be to them fuel to begin a raging fire. In those days the fulfillment of this prophecy will come. The gifted ones whom I have seen will worlds unseen walk the earth and awaken it to the King. Hear, then, what I have heard. When they see beyond the sky, when they know beyond the mind, when they hear the song of the burning light, take these gifts of my outstretched hand, weave them together. Ishal come. The fire crackled and warmed Maggie's face and hands. A brisk breeze had nearly dried out her clothes, although her coat still hung over a tree branch next to Nicolas's shirt and vest. Beyond the glow of the fire, Maggie could just make out the form of her friend, pacing back and forth on top of an old log, now and then jumping and dancing as though he was caught up in a musical sword fight. He was odd, this Nicolas Fisher, but somehow his presence stole all the menace out of the dark shadows of the woods and took all the danger out of their aloneness in an unknown land. He had led Maggie away from the sea and up into the forests as confidently as if he was taking her through his own house. He seemed to belong to the woods, and Maggie was his guest. A deep snuffling sound came from somewhere in the trees and made Maggie jump. It was Bear. She could not imagine how the creature had found his way here, but he had, and she relaxed again. His great black form offered protection against the night. Rachel Starr Thomson. Maggie looked into the fire until the heat and brightness had burned into her eyes. The stillness of the forest worked itself into her. She raised her head to listen when a bird cried somewhere in the dark vastness around. She sighed and stretched out on the ground next to the fire, gazing up through the treetops to the brilliance of the stars. She had been in Cryneth when last she had seen such stars. In London, the ever-present chimney haze kept all but the brightest of the distant fires from sending their light to the world below. Nicolas appeared in the firelight and collapsed into a cross-legged heap. The firelight glinted on the gold in his ear and traced strange shadows on his face. Maggie rolled over and lifted herself onto her elbows so she could look across the fire at her half-wild friend. "Why did you come back?" she asked. "You were in danger," Nicolas said. "How did you know?" Maggie pressed. "You said you were going to the forest. You should have been halfway across the city by the time the Hound reached the inn. What brought you back?" Nicolas sighed, as though he was going to regret opening his mouth. "I heard someone talking. I heard the Hound coming after you." "What do you mean you heard it?" Maggie asked. Nicolas shrugged, a strange little smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I heard voices, and I knew you were in danger. So I went back." "I don't know anything about voices," Maggie said, questioningly. "All I saw was the Hound. But you couldn't have. It's not possible to. Worlds unseen, my ears often hear things that no one else can," Nicolas said. "It's a gift." Curiosity rose up in Maggie. The guardedness had gone out of Nicolas's voice, as though he had let out his secret and didn't care now how much she knew. "What else do you hear?" Maggie asked. "Besides dangerous voices in the dark." "I hear the grass grow," Nicolas said slowly, And I hear the stars singing. They sing? Maggie asked. Nicolas nodded. Yes, he said. I hear other things, too. Sometimes I can hear what Bear is saying. Maggie looked up at the hulking form just beyond the glow of the campfire. Bear talks, she said flatly. Well, not exactly talks, Nicolas said. He feels things and thinks things, and sometimes I hear what he means. Does he speak the language of the Empire? Maggie asked, feeling ridiculous but unable to stop herself from asking. No, of course not, Nicolas said. He just feels things, and sometimes I understand them. Nicolas laughed a little nervously. That doesn't make much sense to you, does it? Maggie ignored the question and asked another of her own. Have you always been able to understand him? No, he told her. When I was a child, I would listen to rabbits and squirrels and birds, and it was hard to understand them, too. But I kept listening and trying to understand, and one day I did. I still don't understand everything. Maggie felt herself drawn to the strange young man across from her. It was fascinating what he was saying, perhaps absurd. Yet she believed him. Rachel Starr Thomson, what else can you hear? She asked, leaning forward with her chin resting in her hand. Nicolas's eyes met hers. How many people had he ever spoken to like this? Who, in all his life, would ever have believed him? Even the gypsies thought he was mad when he spoke of hearing, although they were not so quick to dismiss it the way others did. They wondered sometimes if madness was not a gift. When babies cry, Nicolas said, I know what they want before their own mothers do. Sometimes I can hear a baby talking while it's still in its mother's womb. What do they say? Maggie asked, a smile of wonder beginning to tug at her own face. It's hard to understand them, Nicolas said, but not so hard as with the animals. Mostly they dream about the world out here, and they wonder why so many of the voices they hear are angry and worried. They dream and they wonder and then they go back to sleep. And when they wake up they wonder all the same things over again. Maggie laughed. Nicolas chuckled, but his laugh ended in the creases of a frown. Sometimes I wish I could tell them to stay in there. If they come out here they'll just join the voices of anger and worry and fear. And once in a while, Nicolas continued, I hear voices talking from all over the place. I don't know who they belong to. I can't always tell where they're from. But I can hear them. His voice trailed off and he looked away. I haven't told anyone about my hearing for years. Not since I was a child. Maggie wished he would continue, but she sensed he had already said a great deal more than he'd meant to. Worlds unseen, where were you going? He asked, changing the subject abruptly. Before the Hound came, to Pravik, Maggie said. Her expression changed suddenly, and she jumped to her feet. Nicolas was up in an instant, alert as a cat. But only the faint sounds of the night reached his ears as Maggie rushed to the tree where her coat was drying. She reached inside and pulled out a piece of parchment, unrolling it frantically. Nicolas watched curiously. The paper was amazingly strong. The scroll was unharmed, and Maggie breathed a sigh of relief. She realized suddenly that Nicolas was watching her, and that she had cut off their conversation rather rudely. She held up the scroll in explanation. I was going to deliver this to someone, she said. It belonged to an old friend. He would have taken it himself, but he died before he could. Her face clouded over. Nicolas nodded. He cleared his throat. I just want to say that I'd be happy to accompany you back to Brillin. As far as the boat, so you won't have to go alone. Maggie played with the paper in her hands, and she didn't meet Nicolas's eyes. I'm not going back to Brillin, she said. Not until I take this where it belongs. Maggie? Nicolas began, his voice quiet. I told you I heard voices before the Hound was let loose. Someone sent it after you. They might try again. It can't be safe for you here. Maggie bowed her head and walked back to the fire. Just as she reached the rim of light, she turned and faced her friend again. I have to take this to Pravik, she said.
I'm sorry.
I can't. Rachel Starr Thomson explain everything, but I can't turn back now. Especially not now. She sat down and he joined her. When she looked up at him, her face was apologetic. Anyway, she said, suppose I did go back to London and they came after me there. I wouldn't be any safer. You know your way around London, Nicolas protested miserably. You could hide there. They fell silent. Bear nudged up behind them, hanging his massive head over Nicholas's shoulder. Will you help me find the road to Pravik? Maggie asked after a long silence. I'll go with you, Nicolas said. Thank you, she said. No, he said, looking intensely at her. I mean, I'll go with you, to Pravik. But, she protested, you can't just… Do you think I have a life here in Gauss to hold me back? He asked. Bear's my only family. These forests and the gypsy caravans are my only home. It's time we see more of the world anyway. We'll come with you. Her eyes filled with unexpected tears. I don't know what to say, she started. He reached out a hand and touched her shoulder lightly. Go to sleep, he said. I'll be here in the morning. Lord Robert Sinclair, the Laird of Angsley, could not sleep. He had retired to his room on the pretense of a headache. A world's unseen maid had drawn the bedroom curtains and lit a warm fire, and now he lay stretched out on his bed in his stocking feet. The bed was an unusually long one, to accommodate all 6 feet, 7 inches of the Laird's stature. His 60 years had depleted little of his strength of presence. His muscles were still strong, thanks to long days of wandering in the mountains. His mind was as strong as his body. It was quick and sharp, and it burned with ideas and old passions and longings. Yet, for all of that, the Laird was a man on whom life dragged wearingly. The things he longed for were beyond his reach, and he had only memories to keep him alive. Memories, and the strange help of a girl who lived on a mountainside nearby. It had been nearly a week since he had last seen Virginia Ramsay, and he would go to her soon. He had just spent 6 days in Cranberg with people he could hardly tolerate, smiling and simpering until he thought hypocrisy would cause him to explode. Vowing every night in his room that he would never go back there, business or no business. He arrived home tense and ready to snap, and then his housekeeper had made her deplorable announcement, looking insufferably proud of herself all the while. You wouldn't have liked to see him, sir, she had said with a sniff of disapproval. He wasn't one of your station. He was bent so you couldn't know his height, and dirty so you couldn't know his age. He was very insistent that he wanted to see you, said he had something for you, but I put him in his place, I can assure you. I have no use for such peddlers. Did he give his name? Lord Robert had asked. I think he did. Let's see. Daniel Seaton it was. Rachel Starr Thomson, the terrible words spoken. The Laird's anger had drained out of him and he had gone to bed, where he could lay in the old familiarity of his room and let the musty magic of his house calm and console him. He forgot even about going to see Virginia. All he knew was that the longed-for past had come to call, and he had not been home. In hindsight, it often seemed to him that the only time in his life worth living had been the days of the council. For 3 short months Angsley had been home to 7 self-styled scholars, Daniel Seaton among them, in pursuit of a glorious dream. In the 40 years since the abandonment of that dream, those memories had taunted him with what would never be again. Fate was a cruel thing, Lord Robert felt, that it could send Dan Seaton to his very door while he was away enduring the company of men and women who didn't have soul enough to feel the lure of the mysteries that had drawn the council. Lord Robert abruptly left his bed and began pacing the halls of Angsley. Upstairs and down corridors he stalked, passing long rows of windows that looked out on a brown, mountainous highland wilderness, until at last he had reached the double doors of a long-closed room. It was a room that made the servants whisper when they passed it, a forbidden domain with many a wild story shut behind its doors. Impulsively, Lord Robert reached out and touched the brass door handle. It turned easily under his hand, and the doors swung open. The room had not been dusted in 40 years. Lord Robert strode to the end of the room and dashed the curtains open. Sunlight poured in as it would pour into an open tomb, illuminating the clouds of dust that danced in the stale air. He worlds unseen turned from the tall, wide window with its view of the hills to face the room where his dreams had once taken flight over the mountains and far into the past, where the obsession of his life had been birthed. The sunlight glinted off the gold and red bindings of the books that lined one wall and attempted to sparkle on the brass candlesticks that sat covered with dust and gray wax, arrested in its dripping. The candles sat in the center of the room on a long wooden table that had once served as a meeting place for the Council for Exploration into Worlds Unseen. He laid his hand on the table and brought it back covered with the grayness of the years. Had it been so long? The rug on the floor had once been brilliantly red and yellow and green, with its swirling patterns and uniquely woven designs. Now its colors were muted by time and silence. It lay drab and not at all like its memory. Lord Robert walked slowly to the head of the table, where a wooden chair sat waiting for him as it had so long ago. He drew it out and sat down, his eyes struggling to see through the haze of the years to the ghosts of the past. He felt as though they were still there, just beyond the dust. He could hear them talking and laughing, debating and discussing. To his right, his memory could see the small, friendly face of Daniel Seaton, crinkled up in a laugh. Next to Dan sat Eva Brown, plump and pretty, clutching a book of sketches to her bosom as though it was a baby or a precious toy. She was laughing, too, probably at something Daniel had said. Next to Eva sat John Davies, his craggy, serious young face a great contrast to Daniel. John was quiet, not much of a Rachel Starr Thomson man for speaking. When he did speak, he usually bore listening to. His gray eyes would pierce through all distractions and make a man sit up and listen. On these days, Lord Robert remembered, John's eyes rarely strayed from the face of the young woman across from him. Mary Grant was Corinthian like John. She was beautiful, the laird remembered in a startled way. He had forgotten how beautiful. Dark brown hair fell on small shoulders. Wide blue eyes danced with the song that she was always singing. When Mary sang, the very stars above stopped to listen. She sang songs of the ancient days, songs full of glory and valor and prophecy. Songs she seemed to hear floating to her from another world. Lucas Barrington always sat beside Mary. He was handsome and tall, a gentleman of sorts, a young continental with a great deal of wealth and rakish manners. Across the table from Lord Robert sat the other real scholar of the group, talking to Lucas in a strong Eastern accent. Jaron Huss was a thin young man with a neatly trimmed beard and a way of speaking with authority to anyone who would listen. And then there was Evelyn. Her seat, when she was allowed into the council meetings, was at Lord Robert's left hand. She too was beautiful. Her hair was black like the night, her eyes almost as dark. She moved like a panther, smooth and strong. Mystery hung about her like a mist, a fog that called to the laird to come further into its dangerous embrace. Even now, the memory of her was enough to make his heart ache. They were all young in those days. In his memory, the laird heard their voices and saw each expression. Worlds unseen in a split second, the memory changed. He saw Mary stand to her feet, saw the chair knocked back behind her as she rose with passion glaring in her eyes. He saw the finger pointed at the woman next to him and heard the hissing hatred in Evelyn's reply. He saw the hardness in the eyes of those who had been his friends. He heard himself responding, shouting, accusing. He saw his arms around the dark, mysterious woman at his side. He saw Jaron shaking his head. He saw the anger in John's gray eyes. He heard Daniel crying. He saw Eva stop crying and grow hard. So hard he thought a hammer would never break her open again. That day was the end of it all. In less than 3 days the council was no more. They had gone away to Midland, to Cryneth, to Sloxka. Only Lord Robert was left, with Evelyn to stay by his side forever and help him find all the answers he had wanted. Only she had gone too, less than a year later, and she had not said goodbye. On that day, Lord Robert had walked into the council room and closed the curtains. He had shut the door and never come back. On the table in front of him was a book bound with red leather. His fingers brushed away the dust, streaking the dull red cover with brightness. Slowly he opened it. It opened to a page that had been dusty even before the end of the council all those years ago. It was yellow and cracked with age, and on it was written short lines in a sort of rhythm. The words were unreadable, written in a language other Rachel Starr Thomson than that of the Empire. Lord Robert sighed as he remembered the first time he had opened the book and looked at the handwriting of some unknown ancient. An author who might have lived before the rule of the Morel dynasty choked out life and freedom in the world. Jaron Huss had been able to read this language. Huss, Lord Robert reflected, had known many dangerous things. His knowledge of the ancient languages would have been enough to have him arrested. It was a risk that Jaron, as a scholar with an insatiable appetite to know, was more than willing to take. The Laird remembered the Eastern student's description of the underground university, the clandestine teachings of the professors at the University of Pravik. They had taught ancient languages and legends, and history that did not fit the frame the empire wished to give it. The lines of poetry taunted from their resting place on the page. The handwriting swirled and danced across the paper in age-old ink, calling to the Laird to understand. Words tugged at the edge of his memory, and he struggled to recall them as he looked over the poems again and again. The words had been spoken in the Eastern accent of Jaron Huss, as he read the poetry aloud for the first and only time. When they see beyond the sky, when they know beyond the mind, when they hear the song of the burning light, take these gifts of my outstretched hand, weave them together, I shall come. Worlds unseen. Lord Robert was surprised at the clarity with which the words came back to him. He picked up the red-bound book and turned it over in his hands. There were more poems, more words written inside. If only he could read them. When they see beyond the sky. He crossed the room to the window and stood between its cobwebbed curtains, hands tucked behind him. His eyes wandered over the hills, along a small path that rounded the side of the mountain and disappeared. The eyes of his memory continued to follow the path, up the steep hillside, to the rocky outcrop where Virginia would be seated even now. He was seized with a sudden desire to visit her, perhaps to recite to her the words of the poem. She had been born on the land of the Sinclair family, had spent most of her life on the side of the mountain. But it had only been 3 months since the Laird had really become aware of her existence. In an accidental way, he had heard rumors of the blind girl who could see another side of reality. If her visions were fact and not madness, then the things she saw proved the validity of Lord Robert's lifelong belief in another world alongside his own. She had given him back his old beliefs and reawakened his old longings. He went to see her often, and drank in her words as though they were life-giving water, though she gave it to him only in painfully sparing drops. One day he hoped to break through into the world of Virginia's visions. But for now her words were all he had. The path called to him. He picked up the red journal and Rachel Starr Thomson left the room, shutting the doors tightly behind him. Virginia Ramsay's hair was a very dark brown. Most of it was on the verge of turning black, but enough of it was near to turning red to make her overall appearance very striking. Her eyes, which could not see, were green. She spent most of her time sitting cross-legged on top of an outcrop on the side of the mountain, where she could smell the passing of the seasons and hear the birds fly by. The birds thought her a friend, and they would light on her shoulder and whisper to her. Her right hand usually rested on the head of her shaggy old deerhound, who was as deaf as she was blind. On the side of the mountain, Virginia Ramsay heard all that she ever wished to hear. She heard wind, grass, and the songs of creation. And sometimes, on the side of the mountain, Virginia could see. The things she saw were true things, though no one else, it seemed, could see them. She saw beautiful golden creatures and horrible, black shadow things. She saw people, but not as others saw them. She could see into their souls, into the truth of what they were. She could see the childlike heart of her grandfather, the conniving soul of the village innkeeper, and the burning potential of the innkeeper's son, little Roland McTavish, that made him look to her like a lion cub. A kitten now, but with all the strength and power of the beast king just waiting to push its way out. She saw other things, too. Sometimes she saw people in faraway places, and sometimes she saw things that had worlds unseen happen hundreds of years before. One frequent vision had grown stronger and more urgent with the years. That of a great hunting hound, its muzzle dripping with blood and its eyes with hatred. It was tracking her down. This vision she saw most often at night, and then she would wake up coldly terrified, sure that the universe itself was hunting her. The people in the village were afraid of her. They didn't know exactly what it was that Virginia Ramsay could do, but they had the feeling that she knew far more about them than they would like anyone to know. Everyone in the town was polite to her, while most of them would have done anything to keep her sightless green eyes away from them. The deerhound under her fingertips growled low, sending a rumbling shiver through his lean body. "Hush," Virginia said. "It's only the laird, I think." She bowed her head as he approached, tired at the thought of talking to him. He asked such insistent questions, firing them like arrows one after another. What she saw lay deep inside of her soul. To reveal it to another was like tearing open a wound. She did not fault the laird, for he obviously did not understand. He thought that she could explain her sight as easily as he could describe a sunny day. She might have grown angry with him, except that in him was a strength and a spirit she did not possess. He was her protector. Her grandfather knew it, the town knew it, and she hoped that the hunting hound of her visions knew it. Someday she would need him, so she spoke with him when he came. Besides, underneath all of his selfish questioning, Rachel Starr Thomson sensed a deep need in him. He had wounds of his own, and something in her wished to heal them. At the same time, something in him drove her back. His wounds were festering, infected with a blackness that both frightened and drew her. His voice broke through her thoughts. She heard and felt him sitting near to her, as the deerhound growled low and deep but did not move. And then she felt it. A strange sensation, one she had not known in the laird's presence before. She felt drawn to him. No, not to him, but to something with him. Her skin prickled with its nearness. "I read a poem today," Lord Robert said. "I wondered if you might like to hear it." The prickling, tingling sensation had grown so strong that she could not quite understand what he had said. Her voice, answering him quickly, was urgent. "You have something with you?" There was a pause, as Lord Robert was taken aback by Virginia's intensity. "Yes," he answered. She took her hand from the plaid wrapped around her and stretched it out toward him. "May I have it?" she asked. He made no audible reply, but in a moment she felt the rough, cool leather of an old book in her hand. She took it gently, drawing it close to her and letting it fall open. She ran her fingers over the open page, trying to feel the paths of ink on the rough old paper. Warmth emanated from the handwriting and then began to flow from the page into her hand, traveling up her arms like a shock. She gasped deeply as colors began to flash before her eyes, patterns and pictures whirling before her. The sounds and smells of the Highland world's unseen hills sank into oblivion before the dizzying force of the vision. In a moment the colors had settled themselves into forms, and scenes began to move through her mind. She saw a warrior of ancient days, his hair the color of flax. He rode a spotted horse that moved with the slow, painful steps of exhaustion. His coat and hooves were flecked with blood. Around and above him was the deep green of a forest. Below him, roots tangled in black earth. Others rode all around him, similarly weary, and dressed in the blood-spattered, dirt-ravaged clothing of desperate men. On a white horse at the head of the party rode one whose features Virginia could not describe. Every time she thought she could, his face seemed to change. The only constants were the sense of power that rested on him and an accompanying sense of grief. The scene dissolved in light. The light formed itself into a pulsing circle. The leader of the men stood before it. Virginia watched as he stepped back into the circle, and the light enveloped him completely. She watched as the warriors followed him beyond the forest, through the circle. The scene shifted, and she saw the flaxen-haired man sitting alone beside the dying embers of a campfire, holding a red book in his hands. He was writing words that burned their way into the pages. Suddenly everything changed. She no longer saw the forests. Instead, she saw three black-cloaked figures with eyes like deep pits. The foremost of them held a scroll, newly signed and rolled. One opened his mouth to speak, and from his mouth flowed pestilence. The scene changed once more, now flashing images at her in rapid succession. She saw faces, and she felt that she was no Rachel Starr Thomson longer seeing the ancient past, but the present. Through her mind's eye she saw a woman sitting at a harp in a small cottage, singing a beautiful song that wove its way through the visions of others. She saw a boyish face with a thick head of curly black hair, his mouth laughing with delight. She saw a beautiful young woman with long white gold hair, tending roses and vines in a quiet garden. She saw two tall figures in black cloaks, stretching out their hands toward a circle of fire. She saw a girl on a mountainside, wrapped in red plaid, and with a shock she realized she had just seen herself. Once more all the scenes and colors blurred together and then spun out to make a new scene. This time she saw the flaming walls of a city. She saw a tall, hooded man on a horse, lifting up a sword with a mighty shout. Around him the very sky throbbed with golden light, underlying power, passion, mystery. She saw a very old man, with a long beard that reached nearly to his waist, lift his hands up toward heaven while swords clashed all around him. She saw an auburn-haired girl on a castle wall in the city, running along the stones, seemingly oblivious to the danger beneath her. One last time everything changed, and she saw the raging waves of the sea. Standing in turbulent stillness over the waves was an army, its golden radiance casting a glow on the clouds and black water all around. The sea wind tore through the hair of horses and warriors. Armor and steel clashed as thunder and lightning split the sky. Just before blackness overtook the vision, Virginia thought she saw the shape of a man stepping back through a circle of light, speaking words that were just beyond her hearing. And then she took a deep breath of the heathery world's unseen mountain air, and she felt Lord Robert's hands gripping her shoulders, and heard the whine of the deerhound. The laird's voice came through the fading shock. "Are you all right?" She managed a nod, and his voice dropped to a hesitant whisper. "What happened?" She moved against his grasp, and he released her. She brought her hands up and covered her face. The deerhound's lean body rubbed against her. "I have seen," she said, and found that she could not go on. Rachel Starr Thomson brightly colored paths. The men were rough and rude, and Roland McTavish didn't like them at all. They demanded the best rooms and the finest food in the inn. The McTavish, Roland's father and the owner of the inn, did all but lick the ground where they walked. Roland took their horses for them and said nothing when they cursed at him and told him to be careful with the animals, and called him boy, and threw him a shilling for his trouble. He knew who they were. Everyone did. They were Imperial High Police, imposing figures dressed in black and green. But that did not give them the right to treat the villagers like inferiors, Roland thought. Here in this land where his family had lived for hundreds of years, maybe even before there was any such thing as high police, even before there was an empire. Other boys in the village talked with bright eyes and high expectations of the day when they might be recruited by the high police. They spoke of going to Athram, the great city of the emperor, to train, and of becoming great warriors. Roland, the only son of his father, knew that he might one day be taken into the ranks of black and greens, worlds unseen, but for him there was no joy in the knowing. When the men went to bed drunk that night, Roland kept the village children entertained with imitations of their peacock strut and harsh accents. He did not learn to be afraid of them until the next day, when they began asking after Virginia Ramsay. They went to Wee Cameron first, the 5'2" blacksmith with arms like iron pillars. Roland was in Wee Cam's shop, helping shoe a horse, when the soldiers came in, asking where to find a blind girl who was rumored to have strange gifts. Wee Cam chewed on a bit of straw and looked at them with squinty eyes out of a sooty face. "What would you be wanting her for?" he asked. One soldier answered, "She's wanted in London." He grinned. Wee Cam spit and folded his enormous arms over his chest. "Sorry, but I canna help you." The soldier stepped forward menacingly. "I'm asking as an officer of the Empire," he said. Wee Cam drew himself up to his full height and glowered at the soldier from a face that was nearly as ruddy as his hair. His eyes sparkled with heat borrowed from the forge. "And I'm tellin' you, as a citizen of this village, that I canna help you." The soldiers backed out of the shop and went in search of more amicable help. A look passed between Roland and Wee Cam, and without a word Roland left the horse to Cam's able care. The men were on their way back to the inn, and Roland followed them with a mounting sense of dread. Rachel Starr Thomson, he listened as his father told the men how to reach the side of the mountain. Roland wondered if the men would toss his father a coin for his troubles. No doubt the McTavish would be properly grateful for it. Before the McTavish had finished detailing the way to Virginia's outcrop, Roland was running for Anxley as fast as his feet could fly. He ran first for the little stone house where Grandfather Ramsay would even now be working the land, but he changed direction midway and ran for the great house of Robert Sinclair, Lord of Anxley, instead. This was the laird's land. There had to be something he could do. Lord Robert had not been gone half an hour when light began to probe once more at the corners of Virginia's darkness. But there was no shock this time. No swirling, reeling bewilderment of color and scene. Instead, gentle rays of light found their way through to her eyes. They illuminated no strange scene, but her own hillside. She saw the rock and earth beneath her and the blue sky overhead, speckled with clouds. She saw the colors of her own skirt and the plaid wrapped around her shoulders. She saw the deerhound sleeping by her side, its rib cage rising and falling under a cover of wiry fur. She turned her head to look at the worn path that stretched away from the outcrop and down the mountainside. Someone was coming up the path toward her. As he came closer, a breeze rustled through the grass ahead of him. It carried the scent of spring flowers and running water. Virginia felt something stir inside her. His shadow fell worlds unseen over her, but it was not like a shadow. It was like light coming through raindrops. She looked to his face and found that she could not describe him. He seemed young, but then he seemed old. His skin was neither dark nor white. He wore a homespun robe and his feet were bare. He came very close, and Virginia stood to meet him. He held out his hand to her and she took it, without hesitation or fear. His touch was strong and warm. "Do you know who I am?" he asked in a voice as indescribable as his face. She nodded, slowly. "You are the king." "Do I look like a king?" he asked, glancing down at his homespun robe and bare, calloused feet. "Yes," she answered. He smiled. "You see very clearly, little one. What do you know of me?" "Only that I will follow you wherever you go, if you will let me come," Virginia said. His presence filled her with a sweetness and peace that she had never known. All that was in her reached out to him. The only fear in this moment was that he might leave, as all visions left. "You name me king," he said. "Of what kingdom? Can you tell me that?" "I do not know," Virginia faltered. "But, if my heart can be called a kingdom, then you have a throne in it. Somehow, I think you always have, though I have never seen you before today." A distant light appeared in his eyes. "Be it known, then," he said, "that I am the king of all the world and all the sky and all the stars, and of all the vast worlds beyond them. There was Rachel Starr Thomson a time I walked this earth and all hearts knew me. But they have forgotten. They wanted to forget." The sadness in his voice tore at Virginia's heart, and all she could say was, "I'm so sorry." "So am I," he said, smiling again. "But you and a few others will wake the world to me. Yes, your heart is a kingdom, and I am king in it. Be ready, for I will come soon." "Can I not go with you now?" Virginia asked, for he had begun to move away from her. "No," he said. "You will come to me some day, but not for a time. Can you be courageous, little one?" "Yes," she said. "My enemies hunt you, and you must face them," he said. "Do not forget who I am. And do not forget who you are, no matter what happens. This day I have called you mine." Far away, Virginia thought she heard the baying of a hunting hound. For the first time since she had first seen the shadow creature in her visions, she felt no fear at its coming. He looked toward the sound, and his face was solemn. "Remember me," he said, "and through you I will wake the world." He let go of her hand and stepped back down the path. Behind him a circle of light flared into being. He faded away into it. In the next instant Virginia's sight was gone. The loss of his presence left an echo in her of such deep longing that she fell to her knees on the path and wept. Roland fell against the oak door. He pounded on it with worlds unseen all the strength he had left, panting for breath. His knees buckled under him when the door swung open, revealing the housekeeper's stern face. "What do you want?" she asked. "Please," the boy gasped. "I need to see the laird. It's about Virginia Ramsay." "What about her?" said a deep voice from the shadows behind the housekeeper. Lord Robert stepped up to the door. Roland started to answer, but his words trailed into nothing as the world spun around him. The laird knelt down beside the boy and lifted him up, brushing blonde hair back from the child's face. "Come now, boy. What do you have to tell me?" he asked. Roland drew a deep breath of air. "They're going to take her away," he said, leaning heavily on Lord Robert's shoulder. Who is?" Lord Robert asked. "The police," Roland gasped out. "Village police?" The laird's face was a knot of frowns. No, Roland said. "High police." Lord Robert stood and handed Roland over to his housekeeper. "Get him something to drink," the laird commanded. "I believe he's run the whole 6 miles from the village." With Roland safely in the housekeeper's care, Lord Robert dashed out the door in the direction of Virginia's mountainside. Virginia heard them coming even before the deerhound Rachel Starr Thomson began to growl. The breath of a shadow hound echoed in their footsteps. The deerhound tensed and she rubbed his neck soothingly. "Hush," she said. "Lay still." The footsteps came closer. The deerhound sprang to his feet, ignoring Virginia's entreaties to lay down. The dog's deep-throated growl rose to a crescendo, and he sprang toward the intruders. Virginia heard the sound of cursing and the metallic whir of a sword being drawn. The hound's bark ended abruptly in a long whine. Suddenly the men were all around her. The flat edge of a knife pressed underneath Virginia's chin, forcing her face upward as someone wrenched her arms behind her. She felt a man's breath on her face as shackles closed around her wrists. "Blind as a bat, just like they said," said the man in front of her. His voice became low and taunting. "We're going to take you away, girl. They want to see you, and they don't never let anyone go home again." "What do you think of that, eh?" Virginia said nothing. The knife was pulled away, allowing her head to drop into a bowed position. "Ah," said one of the men. She didn't answer. "Maybe she's deaf too." They laughed. Rough hands grabbed her arms and hauled her to her feet. The heavy iron shackles rubbed painfully against her wrists, and she stumbled as the men propelled her forward. The path, usually so familiar, seemed strange to her feet. They were still talking, joking with each other, but their world's unseen voices were only an incoherent noise in Virginia's ears. She thought she heard the deerhound whine nearby, and her thoughts reached out toward him, longing to go and bury her face in his wiry fur. Had they killed him? She wondered. Was it only her imagination that heard him whining for help? If he was not dead, he was badly hurt, or he would have been at the men long before. Desperation welled up inside of her, and she moved against the grip of her captors, as though she would tear her hands free from the shackles and run for the cover of the hills. And her old hound, her most faithful and understanding companion, would rise to its feet and run like the wind at her side. "Look," one of the men said suddenly, tears. "There's a person in there after all." Someone grabbed her hair and yanked her head back, making her clench her teeth against the pain. He stood close enough that she could feel the heat of his body, and shouted into her face, "Are you afraid, girl? Are you afraid?" She made no reply. He let go of her, shoving her head forward with such strength that she fell to the ground. "Get her up, and let's get out of here," said the man. "Looks like a storm's brewing." The hands were back at her arms again, making the iron bite into her wrists. Before she was steadily back on her feet, a familiar voice rang out over the mountainside. "Lord Robert." He shouted again, a wordless, raging sound. The hands let go of Virginia and she sank down on the path, her heart beating painfully. Her protector had come. She whispered a prayer for his safety, to the one whose words still echoed in Rachel Starr Thomson her heart. "Remember me." The sounds of a fight broke out. Metal clashed against metal, bone against bone, and suddenly all was silent. In a moment the laird touched her shoulder with a hand shaking with adrenaline. "Are you all right?" the laird asked. His voice was shaking like his hand. Virginia started to nod, and instead found herself being lifted in strong arms. "I'm going to keep you safe," he said, "but you'll have to come away with me." In answer she nodded, and then turned her face into his chest and let him carry her away. The Galsic forests were deep and golden with the colors of fall. As time passed, Maggie found herself overwhelmed by the abundant presence of tree, rock, stream, and leaf. Each one so much like the others, and yet uniquely its own, and all occupying one vast, peaceful world. In this place where insects lived for a brilliant day and trees stood guard for centuries, time ceased to hold much meaning. The solitude of the forest bore down on her, now like a weight, now like a song. At times she wished for nothing more than to see a town, and the next moment she hoped that she might become endlessly lost in the woods, never to see another human settlement with its noise and confusion again. If it wasn't for Nicolas, she was sure she would be lost. There were moments when she was quite certain the path led in one direction, but Nicolas and Bear would confidently head worlds unseen in another. When she could see no path at all, they did not slow their steps. Boy and beast seemed equally a part of the forest. They had been in the forest for 3 days. Maggie's shoes were beginning to give way under the constant friction of roots and ruts and pebbles. Her whole body ached from walking. Nicolas, his feet bare, did not seem to notice any strain. He walked until he grew tired, and then they would stop and rest in the cool shade of the trees. Nicolas would curl up and sleep soundly, and Maggie soon learned to sleep when he did. If she did not, the chance would be lost. Even at night they walked. At first Maggie was concerned about food, but what Nicolas did not find, Bear did. They ate roots, leaves, nuts, and berries. Nicolas fashioned a spear from a thin branch and caught 3 fish with it. The scanty fare rarely left Maggie feeling full, but she did not lack for energy. It was late afternoon, and Nicolas was singing. The song was a nonsensical spinning of melody and words without any meaning. His long branch spear waved in the air in time to the music, now and then moving quickly enough to whistle in the air and add punctuation to the song. The path moved steadily downhill. A piece of rock gave way under her foot, and Maggie slipped. She winced at the strain on her sore muscles as she struggled back to her feet. Nicolas turned at the sound of her fall and ran back to her. He offered his hand, and she gladly took it. She brushed herself off, grimacing as her fingers brushed a tender patch on her leg. "Oh, that's going to hurt later," she said under her breath, envisioning a purple bruise. She let out a breath of air and Rachel Starr Thomson started to walk forward again. But Nicolas stopped her. "You look tired, Maggie," he said. For the first time he seemed to notice the weariness in his companion's step. His face crumpled into such an expression of worry that Maggie almost laughed at the sight. He gestured downhill. "There's a good resting place just down there," he said. "Come just a little further, and then you can rest as long and hard as you like." Maggie couldn't help smiling as he clambered down the hill just ahead of her, now and then telling her how good a resting place they were coming to. It was a good place, indeed. Maggie almost fainted with relief at the thought of curling up on the patch of moss and leaves and sleeping until she wasn't tired anymore. As Bear puttered around nearby, she lowered herself down onto the welcoming carpet and closed her eyes. She had barely begun to dream when Nicolas's urgent voice penetrated her sleep. She opened her eyes a crack and squinted at him. He was peering down at her with great excitement, rambling on about something. It took Maggie a minute to adjust her senses to the point where she could actually understand what he was saying. "Come on, Maggie, we've got to go now or we'll miss them. You can sleep all you want when we get there." "That's what you said about this nap," Maggie complained, clambering groggily to her feet. "Can't we stay here a little longer?" Nicolas was pacing back and forth on the path. "It's not far, I promise. You won't regret it." Maggie's head hurt as she followed Nicolas. She realized worlds unseen that she really needed sleep. Needed it very badly. "Where are we going?" Maggie asked, when she had caught up with Nicolas. "Didn't you hear me?" he said. "There's a gypsy camp ahead." Briefly, Maggie wondered how he knew that, as she had seen no sign of human company in the woods. She bit back her questions. The flight from the inn had given her a sort of faith in Nicolas's instincts, his hearing or whatever it was he had. "Tell me," she said as they walked, "why do we want to catch up with the gypsies?" Nicolas looked at her with a twinkle in his eye. "Let me put it this way," he said. You can ride instead of walking, sleep even when we're moving, and eat meat instead of berries. And they may have feather pillows. Maggie grinned. Don't you think we're going too slowly? Nicolas laughed. Well then, he said. Catch me if you can. Without another word he sprinted ahead through the trees, leaping obstacles like a goat. Maggie ran after him, surprised at the strength that rose up in her at his challenge. They ran for a few minutes until Maggie had to stop for air. She leaned against a tree and gasped in deep breaths, laughing as she did so. Nicolas came back to stand by her. There's a clearing just beyond those trees, he said. Campfires and horse dung all over the place. Looks like they've just moved out. They can't be far. Maggie nodded. After another minute, they headed down Rachel Starr Thomson the path again. Their step was slower this time, but they soon came across the abandoned campsite. A much wider path, clearly distinguishable as a road with ruts on either side, led out of the clearing. On another side, a similar road headed out. Which one? Maggie asked, gesturing toward the roads. Nicolas didn't hesitate, but walked toward the first. This one, he said. They're very close. I can hear them. Maggie shook her head and followed him, Bear at her heels. In a short time she thought she heard voices, and before long, she clearly recognized the sounds of horses, wagons, and shouts. Bear began to grunt as he caught the scent of the camp ahead. A sudden cracking noise interrupted Maggie's walk, and a small figure fell in a shower of leaves from the overhanging tree branches. Maggie jumped back with a startled cry. The creature had nearly landed on top of her. With her heart still thudding in her chest, she broke into laughter at the sight that met her eyes. A boy, no more than 4 or 5 years old, stood in the road, holding a wooden sword. Dark eyes glowered out of a round, dirty face. The boy wore trousers that had once been white, and a green vest without any buttons that exposed a bare chest. Maggie moved toward him. The child's skinny arm lifted the wooden sword defensively. He snarled like a fox. Suddenly his eyes grew large, and he stepped back. Maggie felt the massive form of Bear just behind her. She reached up a hand to touch the animal's head, and held out another hand toward the boy. It's all right, she said. See? He won't hurt you. Worlds unseen, the boy lowered his sword apprehensively, eyeing Maggie and Bear with evident suspicion. His feet remained rooted to the road. Would you like to pet him? Maggie asked, stepping even closer to Bear to demonstrate the absence of danger. Curiosity overcame the child's caution. He took 3 hesitant steps forward. Then, throwing caution to the wind, he let his sword drop limply to his side as he trotted happily forward and reached out to touch Bear's nose. Bear licked the boy's hand with his long, rough tongue. The child laughed. His laugh was musical and free of fear, and Maggie melted under his charm. She crouched down beside him and laughed with delight as his giggles erupted under the force of Bear's sniffing nose and wet tongue. Nicolas's voice broke through Maggie's reverie, coming from somewhere oddly far off. Don't look now, Maggie, he said. But you're surrounded. She jerked her head up, and her mouth dropped open at the sight of the people standing silently all around. They stood on the road and in the midst of the trees, at least 20 of them, dressed in ragged, brilliantly colored skirts and vests and head scarves. Men and women both wore earrings and necklaces, and the women wore loose bracelets. Their hair was long and dark and curly, and they held weapons of many shapes and sizes in their hands. Maggie shivered suddenly. Had she been an enemy of the Gypsies, she would not have stood a chance. Her eyes skirted past the dark, unfamiliar faces to Nicolas. He was standing next to a tall, big-chested man with a black Rachel Starr Thomson beard and long, curly hair. The tall man motioned with his hand. Maggie heard a rushing sound as 15 or so daggers and swords were tucked into homemade sheaths and sashes. She stood awkwardly to her feet as the little boy happily skipped to the side of the tall man next to Nicolas. Bear nudged her arm comfortingly. Nicolas held out his hand. Maggie left Bear's side, walking past the eyes that silently followed her down the wheel-rutted road. She stepped up to Nicolas and took his hand. He presented her to the tall man with a bow. My friend, Maggie, he said. The tall man cocked his head in question. Is that all the name she's got? Nicolas nodded. In Brillin there might be more, he said. But here she's only Maggie. The tall man seemed pleased by the answer. He bowed his head politely. And I am only the major, he said. He spread his hands out to encompass the still silent individuals in the road. These are my gypsies. We haven't got much, but we'll share it with you for as long as you like. Maggie smiled. Her voice expressed gratitude and relief. Thank you, she said. Before she could say more, the major turned and walked down the road, the little boy clinging to his hand and jabbering excitedly. The silence of the crowd broke as the air filled with laughter and talk. Nicolas walked at Maggie's side with a proud little smile. They soon arrived at a place in the road where horses impatiently stamped and tugged at reins held by children on brightly decorated wagons. The horses were shaggy, small, and worlds unseen strong, with broad backs and light-stepping feet. Their manes were long and unkempt, but their eyes shone brightly, and the wagon wheels rocked as they strained at their bonds. The gypsies climbed aboard their wagons. Some reclaimed the reins from their children. At the front of the caravan, the major stood on the driver's seat of a wagon painted red and yellow. Beside him, a teenage boy smoking a pipe held the reins and waited. Nicolas climbed into the back of the wagon and pulled Maggie in after him. They moved quickly to the front, where they could see the road and the pipe-smoking boy and the major standing precariously on the seat. The major shouted and Maggie heard a chorus of answering shouts from all around. He raised his bare arm and held it high in the air for a moment, bringing it down with a cry of, "Move out!" The wagon lurched forward as the pipe smoker lashed the reins on the horses' backs. They pulled with a jubilant toss of their heads. The jangling sounds of wagons on the move echoed through the trees. The major took his seat, his broad back blocking the view of the road. Maggie settled back into the wagon, leaning against a wooden cupboard with a sigh. Nicolas pushed past a worn green blanket that divided the wagon into two compartments and motioned for Maggie to follow. In the back of the wagon, 3 bunks were built into the sides. 2 on the left, 1 on the right. Nicolas pointed to the single bunk. There you go, he said. Sleep all you like. And look. He snatched up a plump pillow and threw it at Maggie. Feather Rachel Starr Thomson pillows. Just like I told you. Won't the major mind? Maggie asked as she caught the pillow and let her weary body settle onto the bunk. Of course not. Nicolas scoffed. Anyway, I asked him already. This is your bed for the rest of the trip, so long as you want it. He turned and positioned himself at the back door, ready to leap out into the dusty road. He turned his curly head back to smile reassuringly. Good rest, Maggie. With that, he was gone. Maggie was left with the rocking of the wagon and the lull of the noises outside. She pulled her tattered shoes off her feet for the first time since she had arrived in Calais, swung her feet up on the bed, and laid back slowly, letting herself sink into the softness. Before she knew her eyes were shut, she was asleep. It was dark inside the wagon. Maggie sat up and wondered for a moment where she was. Outside she heard the sound of voices. She felt around on the floor for her shoes, and soon gave up. The air was still warm despite the night. She groped her way to the door and pushed it open, stumbling into the open air. The ground was hard and cool under her bare feet. The air felt open and sweet after the closeness of the wagon. Traces of firelight illuminated the shadowed wagon and made its colors dance, aided by the distant moon shining into the clearing. The caravan was arranged in a circle, with the wagons sitting end to form a wall of wood and world's unseen harnesses. Here and there a campfire burned beside individual wagons. In the center of the circle a large bonfire blazed. Maggie thought she could see Nicolas's slim form in the silhouettes around the fire. She moved toward him. Before she had quite joined those seated around the fire, Nicolas jumped to his feet. He stood with his back to the flames, voice rising. Maggie slipped into the circle, sitting cross-legged in listening silence. The little boy from the road, now wearing a long cotton shirt, spotted her and plopped himself onto her lap. His fingers twined in her sleeve as he listened, wide-eyed, to Nicolas's story. The creature was so close I could feel its breath through the floorboards. Nicolas said. I took all the matches I could find and climbed up on deck. There it was, staring at me, with its horrible green breath and glowing eyes. Took one look at me and roared like a lion. It shook the whole ship. The little boy huddled closer to Maggie. She put her arms around him as she watched Nicolas. I turned and ran for the ropes, Nicolas said. Were you scared? Interrupted a boy of about 11. Nicolas drew himself up to his full height and did his best to look offended. I am never scared, he said haughtily. I used my head, and I knew that I would be at better advantage in the rigging than on deck with the monster. The boy nodded apologetically. Nicolas continued. I hung high above the raging sea. The wind tore at my clothes and the monster paced on the deck below. Maggie hid a smile in the little boy's hair. Her own memory recalled a calm sea. She had, after all, been out on it. My eyes fell on a dry pile of rope right next to the beast. The end. Subscribe our channel if you want. Thank you.